Well, it's wonderful to be with everybody this afternoon, and it's a tremendous honor to be here at the forum, to be here in Bali, and as everyone has commented, it is such a special place. I mean, where better in the world to have a global forum on tourism than here in Bali? It feels like we're all very much at home. The purpose of the next 15, 20 minutes is to share with all of you some work that we've been doing over the last year to try and lay out how this industry, and I'm very much struck by the comments of the previous speakers, which rightly say it's not an industry, it's multiple industries, but how we can take the travel and tourism industry and make it a force for good in the world, in a world where we need people to travel, we need to connect communities across the world, and we need to do so in a way that's sustainable. So I'm going to share with you some of the learnings of the report, and then encourage us to have a conversation as a panel. We've got some wonderful panelists coming up to talk about the way in which we can take all the incredible assets of one of the world's truly great industries and enable them to grow and scale and do so in a way that builds a more resilient and sustainable world. Let me just start off with what I think you all know. Everybody in this room is a real expert on this industry, but I want to remind us of just how significant travel and tourism is. 10% of global GDP, unsurprisingly, a tenth of the jobs across the world. In a sense, unsurprisingly, roughly 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Right? None of this should come as a surprise. It's multiple sectors, and when you look at the sectors overall, some are more, if you will, GHG or greenhouse gas intensive than the world economy as a whole, and that would be true for aviation. But on average, this is reflective of the global economy. So what we have is this remarkable industry. It's also one where you have to get beneath the averages. It's all very well to talk about 10% of this and 1 in 10 jobs, but when you look at it and you even begin to disaggregate this extraordinary industry that we're all part of, what you see, of course, is that there are some countries which are even more dependent on travel and tourism than the global average of 10%. And many of those countries, as you can see, are lower income countries, and therefore not only are they dependent on travel and tourism for a very large proportion of their economic prosperity, but in many cases as small islands or smaller economies, they're also vulnerable to how, if you will, the natural environment is changing around us. We have to recognize that alongside the prosperity that this industry brings to almost every corner of the world, it is also an industry that is almost a victim of its own success. And one measure, and it's not the only measure, but one measure of the challenge that we see in travel and tourism is simply on the climate front. And it is where the flight shaming conversation starts. But it's not just about aviation, because what one sees when one looks at the numbers is that, in fact, we have not just transport, of which aviation is a piece, the biggest piece, but we also have substantial emissions from facilities, and we also have emissions that come from the way in which, if you will, this industry exploits natural assets across its operational cycle. And when we look at the underlying, what the climate economists talk about as the business as usual scenario, you will see that the business as usual emissions of the industry grow from 5 billion tons every year 5 billion tons every year to over 6 billion by 2030. And that picture of 5 to 6 is not going to work. It's simply, and I think everybody in this room knows that, but it's not going to work because the world economy has got to go from what is today roughly 50 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2030, we have to be somewhere in the order of 35 billion tons. So we have to cut global emissions from 50 to 35 or less in a very short period of time. And it's implausible that this industry can grow its emissions while everybody else is cutting. It's implausible, it will not happen, and therefore we have to get ahead of this curve. And as people have rightly observed, this is not just about aviation. We can't expect, one bit of the industry is the problem and the rest of us are okay, because it won't work that way. It never does when you need to make widespread collaborative change. So there are other costs, and we've focused here on the climate one simply because it's the easiest one to paint the overall picture. But there are very substantial costs in terms of the degradation of natural assets, of our mangroves, of our forests, of our key, if you will, ecosystems, the coral reefs. There are very substantial costs to local communities. While they generate huge benefits in terms of jobs, the concentration of tourism in very specific hotspots and the lack of diversification that was mentioned earlier by Lisa means that those, if you will, social impacts also get deeply, deeply concentrated. In all of this, it's just to make the obvious point that when we look at this industry, along with agriculture and along with construction, this is the industry that is the third most exposed to climate risk. So if we do nothing, the industry is going to be deeply affected by the underlying trends that are underway. And these costs are imperfect, trillions and trillions of dollars. The global estimate for what's needed to be invested over the next 10 years, right, in adapting to climate change that we can already see is over $20 trillion. And we've kind of got to get, over the next 30 years. And this industry, because it is so exposed, will be more than 10% of that cost. So we've got to get ourselves ahead of this curve. The good news in all of this is that all of you in this room, and listening to the conversation over the course of this morning from the ministers, from industry experts, is that the good news is that no one's, I hope, putting their head in the sand. No one's sitting there going, we've got this already, and we just keep on doing what we're doing. And people are trying to work through what does it look like to change the curve? What does it look like to build back not just to the industry we had pre-pandemic, and we heard this from the last panel, but to build back better and stronger and in a way that makes the industry more resilient and enables that industry to create the benefits that it does across the world in a more powerful, more reliable way. So that is the essence of what we've been spending our time working with stakeholders across the industry, across the world, trying to understand. And here's the essence of what we've learned about not the problem, because it's no good just to admire the problem, but how to solve the problem, how to make meaningful, practical steps to build an industry that can be, if you will, an industry that's a beacon to the world. And these are the 5 dimensions that we all see as the places on which work needs to happen. Climate, nature, the way in which the industry engages with local communities and creates the right kind of employment that allows for the talent that we all want, and which is chronically short today, to be attracted to this industry. A shift in traveler behavior and a shift in the resilience of destinations. We have got to make sure these destinations that we all in the end depend on are future-proofed. And what we've done is in collaboration with many others, try to identify what would be meaningful targets for 2030. You know, is it possible to get to 40% emission reduction? Instead of going from 5 gigatons to over 6, can we cut down from 5 to 4 to 3? And what does that journey look like over the next 10 years? Is it possible to move to an industry that is able to commit to what will be coming up at the COP in Montreal on biodiversity, which will be a commitment to 30 by 30, right? So that this industry contributes to protecting 30% of all, if you will, biomes by 2030 and plays its role in all of that. So we try to lay the picture out in a way that is stretching and credible, and in fact, one where we can put numbers in terms of the economics of what it takes to do all of this. We've been going around and doing the obvious, right? Which is to see whether or not this is all theory, right? It's all just grand ideas that people have, or whether in fact there are already solutions that are just beginning, not in the mainstream, but in parts of the industry to grow up. And again, you can pick your examples, but what I have seen in multiple parts of this industry is an acceleration in the rate of innovation. And we picked an example on aviation, which was hydrogen-based aviation. I know it's short haul, I know it's not long haul, so I'm more than happy to go into a conversation about sustainable aviation fuels. But there's every reason to believe that if we get our act together, we could get to 10 or 15% blending of sustainable aviation fuel by the early 2030s, and we can get on a journey there. But it's not the only solution, and what's so exciting is that there are multiple solutions around travel and climate, and that's only part of the climate story. And the same is true in every single piece of the puzzle. Wherever you look, when you start turning over the stone of what can we do on resilience, you will find destinations that have begun the work and from whom we can learn and where we can think through not just what's the plan, but what are the financing mechanisms and who needs to be at the table and what are the specific solutions. I've been working with President Calderon of Mexico, and he comes back time and again to what they did in and around the Yucatan Peninsula on mangrove restoration, and it's happening here in Indonesia as well, and it's happening here in Bali, as we know, at the G20. So there are solutions everywhere. The problem with the solutions at the moment is about scale. They are small, they're pilots, they're projects, they're not yet systematic in a way that allows them to scale to the size of the challenge we have to take on if this industry is to be truly the force for good that we all know that it can be. And this is an attempt to just put some numbers around the size of the financing challenge and how we go about it. Because if you throw a big number out there and say it's tens and hundreds of billions, this is an industry that's just been through one of the biggest shocks in its life, right? And it's not just sitting there flush with cash when it's had massive hit and is only now in that period of a process of beginning to recover. So anyone who comes from more of the sustainability and environmental world who fails to think through what are the real economics is not doing their job, because it's just going to be fine words and no action. So what we've tried to do is put the numbers. What could it cost to actually, and these are annual numbers over the next 8 years, to get on top of this problem? And it shouldn't surprise us that these numbers, when you add them up and you play with it a bit, will come to being equivalent to the numbers happening in the global economy. We're going to have to invest 1 to 2% of GDP over the next 30 years to tackle climate, to get on top of nature, to build stronger local communities across industries all over the world. It's not just this industry. These numbers reflect the same number in practice for the travel and tourism industry. But the good news in all of this is there are ways to do this so that the carbon markets, if we can take advantage of them, can start helping to finance some of the nature assets that need to be restored to help this industry thrive and be resilient. Many of the investments in facilities do pay for themselves. If you cut food waste, if you reduce energy consumption and come up with more efficient ways, if you embed ESG into the capital, if you will, deployment in facilities, you can cut energy costs and it can pay for itself. But that's all very well for the big players, and you need to have financing mechanisms for the SMEs, who are so important to this sector. Aviation, and I'll come back to that in one moment, and I know my time is up, so I'm going to go for 2 more minutes, but I'm only eating into my own session as moderating with panels, so it should work. But in aviation, and I'd love to have a debate with our other experts on aviation, there is going to be an increase in ticket prices to pay for the necessary shift to sustainable aviation fuels, but they're not dramatic if we do it intelligently. And I'll show some numbers on the next page. And then I do think on resilience, some of this will be publicly financed. But we've got to go from high-level theory to specific numbers, all the way drilled down to even more specific numbers where we can invest in these areas that are essential to the future of the industry. This is just to give you one little sense of what it means to go on the journey, right? We tried to go from all the big numbers to what does it mean for individual trips that travelers would make, journeys that they'd go on, right, from different locations. And what you'll see when you look at this, for business trips, to city trips, to pilgrimages, to beach trips, is that there is an increase over the next few years in the cost of those journeys, much of which will be in the travel component, but none of those costs are doubling the cost. It's way less than the current rate of inflation. It's way less than the increase in airline ticket prices that have been generated by the increase in fuel costs recently. So these are, I'm told that there's massive pent-up demand. I'm told that there is a real demand by travelers to know and believe that they are traveling sustainably. There's a way that this industry can get behind this, particularly if you go all the way back 10, 12 years and recognize that the real cost of air transport per passenger kilometer has actually decreased by over 30% in those 10 years. So this is not crazy. Just to conclude, the G20, we're here at the G20, and I want to obviously honor the fact that the G20 has made travel and tourism one of the industries in which it is paying real attention. And it's doing it for the right reason. It's 10% of GDP. It's 10% of jobs. It's also at the center of what we need to do to change the trajectory on climate and to sort out nature and to connect the global right down to the local. So there's a reason that we're here at the G20, because this industry really matters, and the G20 countries are 72% of the industry when you add it up. There are real areas of action that the G20 and the B20 together, business and government together, can and must take if we're going to change the story. This cannot happen just one company at a time or just one country at a time. We need to do things like bring the top 1,000 companies together, the ones that use a lot of the business travel, and the top governments, and insist that they are at the heart of creating a new market signal by demanding net zero facilities, by coming early into the way in which they purchase their airline tickets. We need to go and be creative about how we build new carbon markets that can actually create finance flows into the destinations that need to be resilient, and where we need to strengthen that resilience through investment. And there are ways to do that, and they're not about going to the moon, they're about building a better industry on Earth. So, huge, huge challenge to change the trajectory and help this industry, in a sense, help itself become not only a force for good, but more prosperous and more resilient and more capable of delivering the outcomes that we want to see. There are an obvious set of actions, from making sure that travel and tourism constantly remains at the top table, at the G20, at the World Bank spring meetings, at Davos. This is an industry whose voice needs to be louder, whose voice needs to be louder. But to use that voice well means then doing a number of key actions, from aviation to resilience, to helping those SMEs, and to making sure that the destinations that are most exposed, most vulnerable, and often are lower income, get our support as an industry with the governments that are essential, and with the travelers to make them resilient and better and open to better futures. So with that, let me thank you all, and invite you to do one thing, which is we will be launching this report over the next 10 days or so. So please do go and not just listen to a few of the words, but go into the detail and see how we can use the work that we've done to make this industry as vibrant as it can possibly be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.